I really want to say thank you to everybody for how that they supported us over the past year and a half with everything going on with COVID, that you guys have continued to support the Friends. You have come to our events, you have watched us on our Zoom events, and you guys have been so flexible and supportive of us the entire time we were away from each other face to face. And even with the face to face, I really appreciate the fact that everybody's also been able to pivot so that we can have smaller groups and do more programs and still have you here. I am very excited, and I'm actually going to just say her name because through the program, I actually want to say one thing first, that Kristin Soren, who is going to be our speaker today, has been a very long-time supporter of the Bucks County Historical Society and the Friends. She is bringing a unique perspective today to this program, and we are very grateful for her to share her experiences, and I'm going to let her share her experiences. I will say that, again, we have some displays up here, and after the program there's also a display in the main hall. And I hope that, again, we all look with our eyes, not with our hands. And Kristin Soren, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for being here today. Our topic for today is Tuesday morning, a personal account of the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. No day shall erase you from the memory of time. This is a quote from the Roman poet Publius Virgilius Maro, otherwise known as Virgil. September 11, 2001 is a day worthy of remembrance, and this year we commemorate that day, the sad and tragic day, 20 years later. The terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the self-sacrificing actions by the passengers of Flight 93 to prevent a second attack on our nation's capital was a national tragedy and unspeakable measure. But we must never forget, and we must never lose sight of the fact that the horror of that day was also a hidden tragedy of epic proportions that everyone impacted by that terrorist attack, such as the innocent victims who were killed that day, their families and their loved ones, and the communities. So for the purpose of this presentation, I was specifically focused on the Al-Qaeda terrorist attack on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center complex and in Lower Manhattan, New York City, recounting my personal experience that day, the compelling experience of others, some who survived and some who did not. The attack on the World Trade Center, one World Trade Center, the North Tower, and two World Trade Center, the South Tower. I worked in one World Trade Center for 11 years with the Port Authority of Newark, New Jersey, specifically with the Office of Policy and Planning. The Port Authority of Newark, New Jersey constructed and owned the World Trade Center. The year was 1962. Guy Tezzoli, I first met Guy Tezzoli in 1991 when he discussed with me information on the construction, the design, and the engineering of the World Trade Towers. The year 1962, Guy Tezzoli, director of the newly created World Trade Department of the Port Authority, said to Minoru Yamasaki, who was selected as chief architect of the World Trade Center project, "Yama, I have something to tell you. President Kennedy is going to put a man on the moon. You are going to figure out a way to build me the tallest buildings in the world." Minoru Yamasaki did just that. Yamasaki designed twin 110-story buildings on 16 acres in Lower Manhattan. The Twin Towers was a daily workplace for more than 35,000 people, and it was offices for almost 450 companies. There was festivities on its plaza, the Austin Tobin Plaza. Yes, there was even free entertainment, summertime, lunchtime performances on Thursdays on the big stage at the World Trade Center. In every sense of the word, the twin towers of the World Trade Center complex were recognized as the most iconic buildings in the world. That is, until the morning of Tuesday, September 11, 2001, the day that everything changed. So, let's take another look at the Virgil's quote, but specifically the background wall. Virgil's quote is on the blue sky wall, the blue sky remembrance wall, at the entrance of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. The blue sky remembrance wall is comprised of 2,983 individual watercolor tiles. Each square represents an innocent victim of 2001-1993 terrorist attacks. Designed by artist Spencer Finch, the blue sky wall depicts trying to remember the color of the sky on that September morning. Well, I remember. The sky was blue, a perfect blue, not a cloud to be seen. Up and down the East Coast, from Boston to New York City, the sky was blue. That morning, I had never seen such a sky so beautifully blue. September 11, 2001. In Boston, early that morning of September 11, 2001, air travelers probably had to get up a little bit earlier than usual. Perhaps they had to finish some last-minute packing, or there was some final arrangements with their families while they were away, or they wanted to be sure that they had ample time to get to the airport, the Logan International Airport. On American Airlines, Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles were 81 passengers, 11 crew members aboard this Boeing 767 aircraft. Among the passengers were 5 Al-Qaeda would-be hijackers. Among the Flight 11 crew was Flight Attendant Betty Young, age 45, a 14-year veteran of the airline. Actually, this flight was not her regularly scheduled assignment. She volunteered to work this flight to earn additional money for an upcoming vacation. American Airlines Flight 11 took off at 7:59 a.m. At 8:14 a.m., the 5 hijackers, the 5 terrorists, proceeded to hijack the aircraft. 5 minutes later, at 8:19 a.m., Betty Young called American Airlines call center. Nadia Gonzalez was on duty that morning at the call center and picked up Betty Young's call. For 23 minutes, Betty Young provided an invaluable account of the hijacking in progress, what was going on Flight 11. Betty Young described the horrors aboard Flight 11, the stabbing of crew members by the hijackers, the use of chemical agents, failed attempts to access the locked cockpit, and so important, she identified the seat locations of the 5 hijackers for the FBI to identify them. Recording the phone numbers, the phone conversation between Betty Young and Nadia Gonzalez was invaluable evidence in the FBI's investigation of the attack. This is a partial transcript of that conversation, Betty Young. The cockpit's not answering. Somebody stabbed in business class, and I think there's mace that we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we're getting hijacked. Our number 1 is got stabbed. Our purser's stabbed. Nobody knows who stabbed who. We can't breathe. Even up in the business class right now, because nobody can breathe. our number 1 is there right now, and our number 5, our first class passenger, our first class gallery flight attendant, and our passengers been stabbed, and we can't breathe. We can't open the cockpit doors. The doors won't open. So now, with Flight 11, Captain John Organowski and First Officer Thomas McGinnis presumed killed by the hijackers, the terrorist hijackers had full control of the aircraft. Flight 11 was now on a suicide path directly headed for One World Trade Center. In New York City, how strangely peaceful everything seemed early that morning. New York had anticipated that with the cloudless, perfectly blue sky was an omen for a perfect day. It was primary election day in New York City, the election of the city's next mayor. It was also the first day of school. So every morning, my daily commute would start at the Raritan train station in Raritan, New Jersey. The Raritan Valley Line, the 5:20 a.m. train, 5:20 a.m. to North Penn Station, and then the path to the World Trade Center terminal. The morning of September 11, my train was delayed getting into North Penn Station. The train ahead of ours, the train ahead of our train, broke down. So our train literally had to push the disabled train into North Penn Station. However, before going to the office, I would attend daily Mass at St. Peter's Catholic Church on Barclay Street in Lower Manhattan. I would regularly attend the 7:20 a.m. Mass, but that morning I didn't get to the path World Trade Center terminal until closer to 8 a.m. Not wanting to miss Mass, I decided to attend the 8:15 a.m. Mass and go in a little bit later. We had that flexibility. After Mass, I would walk the very short distance to the Vesey Street entrance to the World Trade Center concourse. There, I would pick up and buy the New York Times. I was among the crowd of people on the concourse headed for the revolving doors entrance to the lobby of One World Trade Center. I was about 100 feet from the lobby entrance when there was a massive explosion of fire and smoke that destroyed the lobby and blew out the revolving doors entrance. Everyone hit the ground. I covered my head to protect against blown out debris of glass and steel. At first, I thought someone had detonated a bomb in the lobby, perhaps a suicide bomb. Everyone rushed to the Vesey Street entrance to exit the concourse. It wasn't until I was outdoors that I saw what had happened. A woman standing next to me said, "Oh my God, a plane just crashed into the building." There it was, the huge crash area of the North Tower. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into One World Trade Center. How could this be? It was such a perfectly blue sky with perfect visibility. Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower, impacting floors 92 through 98. The plane was traveling at 470 miles an hour upon impact. The plane was not perfectly level when it hit the building. Its wingspan, which is exactly 156 feet and 1 inch, tilted at 21 degrees. It is estimated that the impact was equivalent to 25 million pounds of force. There's a misconception that the plane exploded when it crashed into the building. The plane actually went through the building, the interior of the building, pushing and destroying everything and everyone in its path. Hundreds of people were instantly killed, as well as entire offices were totally destroyed. The nose of the plane's fuselage penetrated through the opposite side of the building. The plane's path of destruction took only 40 seconds. Parts of the plane's landing gear was actually found on the corner of West and Rector Street, 5 blocks away. The aircraft was also shredded as it passed through the building. Its fully loaded fuel tanks, containing about 20,000 gallons of highly combustible jet fuel, ruptured, spilling its fuel contents across floors, down elevator shafts and air ducts, creating a highly flammable, vaporous cloud and deadly combustible condition. The spilling of the jet fuel down elevator shafts caused a fiery inferno in the North Tower lobby, which is what I barely escaped. I think about how close I was to being killed that day. Only a few feet, only a few minutes from being outside the lobby or inside the lobby. The FDNY stated that at the time of the explosion, 20 more people in the lobby were killed. Miraculously, Lauren Manning, who had just entered the lobby at the time, and she was executive of Cantor Fitzgerald, survived, but with more than 82% of her body burned. She spent 3 months in a burn unit in one of the local New York City hospitals and went for over a year for physical therapy. The plane destroyed the building's core column, which included elevators and stairwells. By destroying emergency stairwells, everyone located above the impact area, the 92nd floor, had no way to get out of the building. They were trapped. By 8:57 a.m., a tremendous fire was sweeping through the 97th floor and spreading throughout the upper floors. Thick plumes of smoke billowed from the windows. I thought, this could not be real. Standing on the corner of Vesey and Church Streets, I witnessed the blazing inferno on the upper floors. Smoke billowed from floors 100 to 109. We saw many things that morning that no one should ever have to see. With the heat reaching more than 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, people were clinging to the windows, trying to escape the flames and the fire, or trying to breathe. Men were waving their white dress shirts to draw attention for help. Completely overcome by heat and smoke, people were falling or jumping from the upper floors. They were trapped. There was no way out. So everyone, please understand the magnitude of this unimaginable situation. For these innocent people, it was not a choice of whether a matter of life or death. It was the choice of which death they would endure, and how bad it must have been on those upper floors for them to consider jumping the better option. The demarcation line for survival was the 91st floor. The American Bureau of Shipping was located on the 91st floor, and all of its employees were evacuated. The impact of the plane destroyed all stairwells at the 92nd floor, so no one above the 92nd floor survived. Many companies, including the Port Authority, were devastated by the immeasurable loss. At the restaurant on the 107th floor, an information technology conference was underway at the time of the attack. Attendees included Neil Levin, the executive director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. There were 171 employees, restaurant workers, restaurant staff, and conference attendees there at the time. No one survived. Marsh McLennan, with offices on the point of impact, the 92nd floor and the 100th floor, suffered the loss of 295 employees. Aon, with offices on the 105th floor, had 176 employees died in the attack. Now there's Cantor Fitzgerald. You probably heard a lot of the stories about Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald occupied floors on 100 and 103 through 105, with 658 employees, and like one World Trade Center that morning. 658 employees. Employees were frantically calling family and friends, seeking information. They called 911. They even called the Chicago office for information. They were asking, what should we do? Was help on the way? A heartbreaking story is that Cantor Fitzgerald employee caught his wife. She told him she had just come in and just videotaped a few minutes of the 2.5-year-old daughter's first day at nursery school. Tragically, he did not survive. My employer at the time, the Port Authority of Newark, New Jersey, lost 86 of our fellow colleagues, 37 of whom were Port Authority police personnel, including our Superintendent of Police, Fred V. Malone. With a police force of 1,331 officers, the Port Authority suffered the most losses among law enforcement personnel by an agency on a single day in American history. I worked with several fellow colleagues that died that day, including a colleague, Ezra Aviles, in our Office of Policy and Planning, who was also a very good friend. Our corporate secretary, Daniel Bergstein, died that morning. Dan and I actually had a meeting scheduled for the morning of September 11th. One of my responsibilities with the Office of Policy and Planning was to prepare the Executive Director's quarterly report to the Port Authority's Board of Commissioners. Dan, as Corporate Secretary, was a final review of the report before submitting it to the Executive Director for his signature. About 2 weeks after the attack, our IT department, Information Technology Department, restored our Outlook email service. The first emails I saw when I opened Outlook was my email exchange with Dan on Monday, September 10, 2001. Daniel David Bergstein was 38 years old when he died on September 11, 2001. The story of John P. John P., his nickname was Patch, was a colleague in our Office of Policy and Planning. He and I worked together on various strategic planning projects for the agency. The morning of September 11, John stepped onto an elevator to go to his office. With him on this elevator were 5 other men, including Jan Demick, a WTC, World Trade Center window washer, who was going to his job site. When the plane struck one World Trade Center, the elevator began to plunge downward. One of the men pressed the emergency stop button, and the elevator stopped. The men pried open the elevator door. One of the men had a pocket knife and began to chop at the sheetrock, but dropped the knife in his haste. Window washer Jan Demick had a squeegee and a bucket. They stripped off the rubber from the squeegee and used it to chisel their way through the drywall of the elevator shaft. They were able to break through the wall under a sink in a men's restroom on the 50th floor. John and the other men were able to escape down one of the accessible stairwells and out of the building shortly before it collapsed. Port Authority Police Lieutenant David W. Lynn was assigned to the World Trade Center in 2001. He was trained in firefighting, crime prevention, and elevator evacuation. Lieutenant Lynn and his partner were undertaking a routine security check in the basement of 2 World Trade Center, the South Tower, when the first hijacked plane struck 1 World Trade Center, the North Tower. Lieutenant Lynn left his partner at 2 World Trade Center to investigate the crash into 1 World Trade Center. Lynn climbed to the 44th floor to assist tenants evacuate the building. That is when the North Tower collapsed. Now what happened next is known as the miracle of Stairwell B. Lieutenant Lynn, along with FDNY Captain J.A. Jonas, and 11 other FDNY firefighters and a civilian, Josephine Harris, were in stairwell B when the North Tower collapsed. FDNY firefighters were with another company 6. Miraculously, stairwell B remained intact even after the tower collapsed among the rubble. Captain Jonas was able to establish contact with FDNY. Mayday! 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 He shouted into his radio. Battalion Chief William Blanche picked up on his call. We're coming for you, brother, we're coming for you. 5 hours later, the FDNY firefighters, the civilians, and Captain and Lieutenant Lim were rescued from stairwell B. Lieutenant Lim suffered a concussion, lower back contusions, and leg bruises, but was taken to a local hospital. But his desperate concern was not for himself, but for his partner, who was left at 2 World Trade Center. Lim knew that with 2 World Trade Center collapse, his partner had perished. Lieutenant Lim's partner was serious, a beautiful and loyal 4.5-year-old Labrador Retriever of the PAPD, Port Authority Police Department, Canine Patrol. Sirius was not only Lieutenant's partner, but was also an important part of his family, with his wife and 2 children, and they were devastated by Sirius's death. One day, late in February 2002, canine remains of Sirius were recovered in the ruins of the South Tower. He was in his kennel when Lieutenant Lim had left him on the morning of September 11th. Lieutenant Lim's last words to Sirius were, "I'll be back for you." In April 2002, Sirius was memorialized in a special service at the Liberty State Park in Jersey City, New Jersey, attended by canine teams from around the country. So I'm standing on the corner of Vesey and Church Street with a group of people. Some were gasping, some were crying. We all see what was going on. The building may be federally destroyed, and people were dying. What a devastating catastrophe. This is bad. This is really, really bad. I could not imagine that it could get any worse, but I was wrong. United Flight 175 left Boston's Logan International Airport for Los Angeles at 8:14 a.m. There were 51 passengers and 9 crew members aboard this flight, including 5 Al-Qaeda terrorists. One of the passengers aboard Flight 175 is Brian Sweeney. He was a systems consultant for the aeronautical industry. He primarily worked from home. But on the morning of September 11th, he would board Flight 175 for a business conference in Los Angeles. Air traffic controllers were searching for the whereabouts of American Flight 11, reported to have been hijacked. Coincidentally, the 2 planes, American Airlines Flight 11 and United Flight 175, crossed paths at 8:38 a.m. Ground control in Boston contacted Flight 175's captain, Vince J. Saraceni, and First Officer Michael R. Herbucks, looking for American Airlines Flight 11. Flight 11 was no longer responding to communications. Captain Saraceni and First Officer Herbucks confirmed sighting Flight 11 several thousand feet below. With breakfast service underway, the 5 terrorists proceeded to hijack Flight 175. 3 passengers and a crew member used the onboard seat-back earphones to report the hijacking in real time. One of these passengers was Brian Sweeney. At 8:59 a.m., he left a message for his wife, Jules. This is a partial transcript of Brian Sweeney's message to his wife. Jules, this is Brian. Listen, I'm on an airplane that's been hijacked. If things don't go well and it's not looking good, I just want you to know that I totally love you. I want you to do good, have good times, same to my parents and everyone. And I just totally love you. And I'll see you when you get there. Bye, babe. I hope I call you. This message was saved for historical testimony, the events of that day. At 9 a.m., he spoke with his mother for the last time. 2 minutes later, after speaking with his mom, United Flight 175 crashed into 2 World Trade Center. Employees with Fiji Bank on the 81st floor were gazing out the south side window of 2 World Trade Center. They saw a plane fly past the Statue of Liberty and head directly for their tower. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into 2 World Trade Center. While witnessing the horror unfold as smoke billowed out of 1 World Trade Center, I saw a huge fireball and heard a large sonic sounding boom as the plane crashed directly into 2 World Trade Center. Overwhelmed with anxiety at this time, the crowd at Vesey Street and Church Street dispersed. The police had asked us to vacate the area for several reasons, particularly that they were still falling debris from the buildings. I started to walk to Penn Station, New York, to look for a way to get home. Manhattan was now under lockdown. Flight 175 hit the South Tower between the 78th and 84th floors, traveling at 560 miles per hour. The plane struck the eastern corner of the building. Again, the plane traveled through the building and destroyed everything and everyone in its path. Stairwell A, however, remained intact. This provided the means to evacuate the building. But there was confusion at the time. After the crash of 1 World Trade Center to North Tower, there was an announcement that the building, 2 World Trade Center, was safe. People had to decide whether to evacuate or shelter in place in their offices. Some people decided to ignore the announcement and went to the sky lobby on the 78th floor to leave. So, do you stay or do you go? This was the question people had asked themselves. People had to decide whether to evacuate or to remain in their offices. People had only 17 minutes to decide what to do because there was only 17 minutes between the attacks on the two Twin Towers. In 1 World Trade Center, the North Tower, your fate was determined on what floor you were on, if a person had access to a stairwell to evacuate or not. In 2 World Trade Center, the South Tower, human decisions determined one's fate, whether you were going to stay, shelter in place in the office, whether you were going to try to leave. And like I said, there was only 17 minutes to decide. So, why did the Twin Towers collapse? 1 World Trade Center, the North Tower, was struck at 8:46 a.m. and collapsed at 10:28 a.m., 102 minutes after the attack. 2 World Trade Center was struck at 9:03 a.m. and collapsed at 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after the attack. There are 2 theories of why the Twin Towers collapsed. The first theory: as the fire and heat intensified over time, the fire protection weakened and the floors began to buckle. As the floors buckled and weakened, they sagged and they pulled at the connections, which pulled away from the core and perimeter columns. Second theory: the core column was weakened by intense fire and heat, and ultimately collapsed. The core column plummets and exterior columns buckled under the pressure and collapsed, bringing the floors down with them. It wasn't the impact of the plane, however, crashing into the buildings that caused them to fall. In fact, as Scott just already explained to me when we met, the buildings were constructed to absorb the impact of a Boeing 707 plane. The towers did not topple. The towers swayed, but still stood in place. Primarily, it was the damage inflicted by intense heat and fire caused by the release of the 20,000 gallons of combustible jet fuels. The intense fire destruction of the upper floors compromised the fireproofing over time. So, temperatures in the impact zone and upper floors reached 1,700 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, steel softened enough to lose 50% of its original strength. At 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, it is down to only 25% of its original strength. And now at 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, it's down to less than 10% of its original strength and will collapse. So the reason why the towers collapsed was not necessarily due to the impact of the plane itself, but to the intense heat and fire that over a period of time caused the steel to weaken and then ultimately collapse. From rescue to recovery and cleanup. Following the collapse of the Twin Towers, there were only 21 people who had been found alive and rescued. 18 of these survivors were found in One World Trade Center. 16 of them in a stairwell, which included Lieutenant Lim of the Port Authority Police. Janelle Guzman, a Port Authority employee and a former colleague of mine when I was first with the Port Authority, the Port Commerce Department, was the last person to be rescued alive. At 12:30 p.m. on Wednesday, September 12, about 26 hours after the building collapsed. She was in that rubble for 26 hours and finally was able to be rescued the following day. The Twin Towers comprised of 220 stories. The debris pile of steel and rubble was barely 7 stories high. Noxious fumes and potentially poisonous air permeated the debris pile. Smoldering fires and intense heat continued to permeate the debris pile for several weeks after the attack. A week and a half after the attack, I returned to the World Trade Center site. I was devastated. I was able to get within a block or so of the smoldering debris pile, and I felt devastated. The stench of burning rubble was unbearable. The air was thick with God knows what toxins. It was hard to breathe. My eyes burned, and to be honest with you, I couldn't stay there very long. For the life of me, I cannot imagine how workers worked there for days, weeks, even months, working on the debris pile. About 2 weeks after the attack, it was determined by New York City officials that there was no chance that anyone could still be alive in those conditions. So the rescue effort was now a recovery and cleanup effort. So on that day, September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 people were killed at the World Trade Center complex, including 343 firefighters and 71 law enforcement officials. 2,192 civilians, including 10 hijackers, totaling 2,763 people. It has been reported that over 1,400 9/11 rescue workers who responded to the scene in the days and months after the attack also have died from various forms of cancer. New York City, and indeed our nation, was in shock and grieving this Tuesday of mourning. There was so much and too much tragedy to bear. After I left the horror at One World Trade Center, I headed north on Broadway and waited on the steps at One Penn Plaza with a large crowd waiting for the rail service to resume. There was a van on the side street with a large megaphone on its roof, broadcasting events in real time. There, we heard about the collapse of the Twin Towers. I was able to get a train out of Penn Station, New York, around 3:30 p.m. to North Penn Station, and finally got home around 5:36 p.m. I visited with my parents, who were frantic and distressed throughout the day, since I was unable to reach them to tell them that I was safe. So, throughout the day, they didn't know whether I was alive or dead. Late in the afternoon and evening, family and friends became desperate if they had not heard from their loved ones who were at the World Trade Center that day. Hundreds of people were still missing. Hundreds of people were still missing. Friends, family members posted missing person posters throughout Lower Manhattan and throughout New York City, hoping and praying for an answer they most likely felt in their hearts was not meant to be. I would like to conclude and leave you with this image. It is now nighttime, September 11, 2001, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. You can see a parking lot, perhaps located in northern New Jersey, Long Island, Westchester County. This parking lot is at a commuter train station. In the dimly lit parking lot are vehicles, scattered, remaining in the spaces where they were left earlier that morning. These vehicles may appear abandoned, but they are not. They are not abandoned, but are unplanned that night. These vehicles' owners are no longer, they are gone. So let us remember our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our mothers, our sons, and our daughters, and those we may never know will remain forever in our hearts and shall never be forgotten. Before we resume, I just ask if you could pause with me for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. So I'd like to open up the floor for discussion. If anyone wishes to talk about their experience on 9/11, many of us most likely know where we were, what we were doing on that day. If you have any questions that I can respond to, I'd just like to draw your attention to, on the side wall, is a flag. That flag, rather stripes, has the names of all the innocent victims that day. So if you do know someone, you can try to find the name on the flag. And like Christina mentioned, we do have exhibits that you can peruse as well. So I would like to open the floor for discussion on when anyone wants to discuss where they work, what they were doing on 9/11. And if you have any questions that I can respond to, we want happy to respond to your questions. Mary Ann?
How long did it take before you could get back to work at your job?
Oh, that's
And
very good.
where was your office after that time?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. Now, obviously, I focused specifically on the events of that day. That night, when I got home, about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, our office executive assistant called. She called everyone to see if we were still alive, to be honest with you. That's when we found out that Ezra Barrett was missing. We reported Friday. Now, we reported at Jones Square on Friday morning, just to kind of reorganize our office. Now remember, we had no offices. We had no computers, no files, everything was totally destroyed. So our office director said, the first thing you have to do when you go home is buy a cell phone, because that's the only thing we're going to have available to communicate with each other. We reported that following Monday to Jono Square, we reported Port Authority Technical Center, we call it PATS, Port Authority Technical Center, which is the police administration offices for the Port Authority Police Department. There they found an office for us. There was only 22 people in our office. So what we did was we found office space where we doubled up our cubicles. Instead of one person to a cubicle, we had two people to a cubicle. And our procurement department was able to procure laptops for us that we could use in internet. The thing with the Port Authority is that we're responsible. We're tri-state quasi-government agency responsible for, at that time, not only for a trade center, but also for the airports, Kennedy Airport, LaGuardia Airport, North Liberty International Airport, also for the tunnels and bridges, and responsible also for the various seaports, Port North, Elizabeth, Port Authority Terminal, Red Hook. So we were a massive agency. So the one thing that we had to keep in mind was that we had to keep our operations and our businesses functioning. And at the same time, mourn the loss of 86 colleagues. So our office, we met, we developed plans of what we had to do to proceed. One of the things I was responsible for specifically was I served as a liaison, our office policy planning liaison, to the Emergency Officer Management Office. And there, I would report things that our office was proceeding on to them, and they would report any emergency or management procedures that need to be conveyed to our office. So we worked 12-hour shifts. I had the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift at the time. Also, I mentioned September 11th was the first day of school for New York City. It was also my first day of school. At that time, I was an adjunct professor at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, where I taught undergraduate school for business administration, specifically in the MBA program. So that was my first day of school with my class that day. And I had all my books, all my curricula, all my syllabus and everything else to hand out that way. I think we're scheduled to teach a course in human behavior in organizations. So they asked me if I still wanted to teach, and I said, give me a week and I'll be back. And I was back teaching at night, and our department director worked it out so I would be able to go there evenings, even though I had the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift with the Office of Emergency Management. So I know it's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's essentially what happened. Yes?
How many employees, how many employees were lost with your company?
Okay, 86 of our employees died that day. 37 of which were with the Port Authority Police, and one person from our office died that day, but I knew other employees who worked in other offices. As I mentioned specifically with Dan Bergstein, who was the corporate secretary. He and I worked together closely regarding the executive director's quarterly report to the authority and board of commissioners. But all in all, the Port Authority lost 86 employees.
Did any escape at all that were in the building? Or?
Oh yeah. The thing is, if you were below the 92nd floor, you had time to escape. And people in our office at the time now, interesting question you asked me, everything, because I would normally be back in my office by 8 o'clock, things being even. And at that time, there was only about 5 or 6 of us at the office at 8 o'clock. Myself, a fellow David, another fellow, and a secretary. So there only maybe 5 or 6 of us at 8 o'clock. Most people would come about 9 o'clock. So at the time of the attack, there was only 3 people in our office. I was in the concourse when they got up to my office. So people in our office escaped. That's what stayed behind with the superintendent of police. And that's why they perished. He had every opportunity to escape, every opportunity to evacuate. He stayed behind with the superintendent, with the police, to help other people evacuate. And by the time they realized it was getting desperate, it was too late, and they didn't have a chance to get out of the building in time. Any other questions? Any comments? Go ahead.
I have a question about the subway system and the rail system.
Okay. The director of PAD at the time was Victoria Cross, and what she did was immediately shut down PAD, which thank God, because that saved a lot of lives. She shut down PAD. People who were at PAD at the World Trade Center terminal evacuated immediately. They were easy to get out of here. Other PAD trains did not leave the stations, whether at Journal Square or Grove Street or Hoboken. Those were the key central points of the PATH system. If you're familiar with the PATH system, the World Trade Center terminal at the time, Journal Square, Jersey City, Hoboken, and then Grove Street. So they did not leave. She shut everything down. So trains were not coming in the PATH World Trade Center terminal at the time of the attack. So it's her quick thinking that saved a lot of lives. As far as New York City subway is concerned, I really don't know too much about what they did. All I can tell you is that after the police told us to evacuate, when we were standing on Church Street, they told us just to get out of the area because it really got to be very dangerous there. With the refloating, and at that time, when I first saw the building, I didn't think they were going to collapse because really no high skyscraper in New York collapsed because of fire. So the FDNY thought they had quite a few hours to work and get some kind of system up there to get people down from the upper floors that were trapped. But they didn't. The buildings collapsed, as you can see, within a few hours. Or less, much less. But so I really don't know what to do with the New York City subway system. I'm sure they shut it down at some point. But with PATH, Victoria Cross County, she shut it down immediately. Kathy?
I'm just kind of curious if you have any information about the building that replaced the Twin Towers
Okay.
and how they have, what modifications have they made in that building to prevent this from happening again?
Okay. First, in the sheet you have, it gives you all the different buildings in the World Trade Center complex. The Twin Towers were only 2 buildings in that complex. Okay. 2 other buildings in that complex that were destroyed at the same time as well. 7 World Trade Center didn't collapse until 5:28 that evening. It caught fire after some of the rubble from 1 World Trade Center basically fell upon it. Now, the present structure there now is 1 World Trade Center, formerly called the Freedom Tower. And that's what they called it at first, which I hated that name. I mean, I think we should have immediately called it 1 World Trade Center. And thank God, I think it was 2018, they decided to call it 1 World Trade Center. So, it's 7,776 feet high. However, only floors only go up to like 70-some floors. So you don't have offices on 109th floor, 110th floor, 105th floor, like you have with the former World Trade Center. And ironically, the higher rent tenants were on the upper floors because they had such a fantastic view. So the higher you up on the World Trade Center, whether it's Tower 1 or Tower 2, you pay higher rent because of the top of the view you have. So with the present 1 World Trade Center, they don't have offices on those high floors anymore. They've increased security, and also they designed it so that it's a sturdy building. Also, the Port Authority, once World Trade Center was finished, Port Authority moved its offices, which were scattered throughout New York City and New Jersey, into World Trade Center, which is now the headquarters office for the Port Authority of New Jersey. Interestingly enough, in the 1960s, the Twin Towers and the Path Terminal cost $400 million to build. Both Twin Towers plus the Path Terminal at that time was $400 million to build. Just the new One World Trade Center cost $3.9 billion to build. So you talk about inflation. But part of that complex now is primarily One World Trade Center, Four World Trade Center, the Path Terminal, the footprints of the memorial, and the Memorial Museum. So that's the complex as it presently exists. Any question, Doctor?
I was just gonna say thank you for your talk. I was at the museum 2 years ago, so you certainly shed a lot more light than it's very moving to go through that.
Kathy and I were at the museum probably about 2-3 years ago, and if you haven't had a chance to visit it, and I'm going to give a plug to our friends board, perhaps when COVID is no longer, a nice bus trip will be to the 9/11 Memorial Museum and grounds. But it is breathtaking. And one of the things that is most moving to me, they have a room of remembrance where the photos of everyone who died at the World Trade Center that morning is depicted in this room of remembrance, which is very, very emotional, very, very moving. So if you ever have the chance, opportunity, once appropriate, to visit the Memorial Museum, the grounds, it's really worth the visit.
If I'm not mistaken, that they also played all the cell phone messages as we were standing there, which is amazing.
I don't know if they have that at the one, I know they have that at the United Flight 93 Memorial. And I think they do have at the Memorial Museum in New York City, the various telephone messages that people in the building left for their loved ones. Like I said, they knew they could knock it out. They knew that they could knock it out. They knew they could not escape the fire and flames, and it was only a matter of time. And like I said, I can't imagine being in a position where the better option is to jump and move 100 floors up. I mean, that is just unimaginable to me, at least. And being on the ground, witnessing that, me safely on the ground, but people up there knowing that they'll be taking their last breath any moment, is just catastrophic. Yes, Marianne?
Did they ever interview the architect afterward, he was still living, that see if he had cut any corners in the
No.
buildings that could have been prevented from collapsing so soon?
It's interesting you asked that. The architect was Minoru Yamasaki. He passed away a few years ago.
I appreciate that.
He died 2 years ago.
A few years ago.
Oh, a few years ago.
A few years ago. As the guy told, he passed away a few years ago too. What they did was they built the building with an interior core. And if you look at the cover sheet of your handout, those are perimeter columns. Each side of the building had 59 perimeter columns. And they were interlocked together. They're usually 3 stories high, but interlocked together. And they were the primary support system of the building, plus the interior core. Now, if you remember, in 1993, there was the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. It was a truck bomb in the basement of the building. At that time, I was on the 44th floor. I ended up in an emergency room at a hospital for smoke inhalation. That's another story. So after what they realized afterwards, they reinforced the fire protection throughout the core columns. They put lighting in the stairwells. We had to walk down 44 flights in a dark stairwell. And they added security desks in the lobby. So if you had a visitor coming, you had to pre-arrange that visitor's time and visit. And the visitor had to identify himself, show ID, and then you had to basically confirm entrance for that visitor. So they instituted a number of security measures. One, as I said, the building was constructed to absorb the impact of a 707 Boeing jet. And the 767 jet is not that much larger than the 707. But it was the intense fire and heat that eventually weakened the fire protection, and eventually, over a period of time, weakened the floors, and then it collapsed. Now, you might ask, well, why did one building stay up for 102 minutes, the other building stayed for only 50 minutes or so? The first attack on one World Trade Center hit the 92nd floor, so there was less weight above the attack. And the second plane hit the second tower on the 78th floor, which gave it more weight. The purpose of the attack was to have so much weight that the buildings would actually topple onto the local neighborhood. That was the game plan of the 1993 bombing and the terrorist attack in 2001, that the buildings would not collapse straight down, but would actually topple onto other buildings in the area. So the Port Authority did take various measures to improve both fire protection, security, and then after that, the 1993 attack, our officers had periodic fire drills, evacuation procedures, we had fire marshals within our offices. So, but when it comes right down to it, if you have a plane flying at 470 miles per hour that's straight for your building, nothing's going to stop that. With the whole idea of suicide, these were terrorists on a suicide mission, and nothing was going to stop them. Go ahead.
Yeah, Lisa, first I want to thank you. I can imagine there are easier days in your life than what you're doing today. But what I had in mind might be a little different question. Do you feel this day in history, 2 decades ago, changed the nature of your sleep in such a way, in your dreams, that you maybe changed your life in a way that before you never would imagine it has? Now, how it has is your affair. I'm not asking you to go into it. But do you feel that somehow in your sleep, if your dreams have been changed, it has changed your life some? How? That's your affair.
I'll take on that personally, and then I'll give you some examples generally, okay? Personally, afterwards, there were occasions where I would have some nightmares about it. Others did as well. What strengthened us, the Port Authority had offered, and the Port Authority was great in offering whatever kind of mental health assistance you needed on your pace. But what gave us strength, what gave me strength, was being with my fellow colleagues, because we were all in this together. Now, not all of my colleagues were in the building or near the building at the time, but we all worked together, and we all drew strength from each other. Like I said, we lost one of our colleagues that day from our office, and we remember him dearly. Part of why I do want to mention him and Dan is to kind of let people know, that they were courageous that day, that they could have escaped, they could have evacuated, but they didn't because they stayed behind to help other people. So, initially, after the attack, we were really too busy trying to keep things going. We had memorial services where it was very somber, very sad, and very mournful. And we, like I said, importantly, we supported each other. And I think that was the core of not only my support coming from other colleagues of mine in my office, but me supporting them when they needed it. And people, they go for therapy. people needed to be able to discuss it, whether it's with a therapist or with the local clergy or with someone. But by and large, we never put it behind us. I'm not saying that, but at that point we needed to focus on what we had to do, but keep in mind the loss that we had suffered. Yes, Manager?
I just watched a movie on Netflix 2 nights ago called Worth, and it's a true story based on the compensation that was given to the survivors of victims and all, and how they decided that. It was very interesting.
Yeah, right after 9/11, there was interest in putting together a compensation fund to help not only the victims, but also over the course of years afterwards, the rescue workers and the first responders who worked at the grief pyre for days and weeks and months, who at some point came down with various types of cancers and illnesses because of the exposure they had. So I don't know what the details, but I know Congress has passed legislation putting that in motion, so people will be compensated. The families at least compensated. Yes?
You indicated in the talk that there were 17 minutes between when the first tower was struck and the second one.
Yeah.
And do you have a sense of how many people were in the second tower and how many actually got out?
Okay. I don't have the exact numbers, but I can say this. Okay. What's interesting is that, as I said, it was election day, primary election day in New York. It was the first day of school. For some people who normally would have been in those towers were not, because they figured, okay, it's a beautiful, believe me, it was a beautiful day that day. So they figured, okay, I'll go vote now, and I'll go in a bit later. This way I don't have to worry about going the party after work. Or it's a nice day, I'll bring my child to school. So a lot of people who normally would have been there that day, and as I said, during the course of a day, there are 35,000 employees in those buildings, but during the course of a day too, between tourists and visitors and other business people, you could have up to 140,000 people in that complex, which is a small city. So I don't know how many people were exactly in each tower, but I can say this: the people in Tower 1, if your floor was below 91st floor, you had time to escape. And Tower 2, you had less time, but you still had time to escape. But all in all, almost 3,000 people died that day, including people in the aircraft. So it was a tragedy because how you look at it.
If I'm not mistaken, the president of Cantor Fitzgerald himself was not there because I think his son was going to school, it was his first day of school, and he stayed there.
Yeah, the prophet, I don't remember his name, President Cantor Fitzgerald actually was interviewed on Larry King that night, which I watched, and I do have the transcript of that. But he was interviewed on Larry King that night, and he was sobbing uncontrollably because of their loss. They lost, I think, at least more than a third of the company's employees on that one morning. And Cantor Fitzgerald, with its offices above the 92nd floor, all the employees that they had at that time in those offices were killed. But he was not in the office at that time, and it was beyond devastated. But let's share if anyone here wants to share where you were that day, what you were doing that day. I think everybody was interested in hearing that.
It's not so much where I was that day, but it makes me reflect on living in present time and not worrying.
Yeah.
We have a member of our congregation who should have died, but he was curious and left the building to see what happened in building 1
Yeah.
when they hit building 2. And he just kept walking and lived. I have a friend whose 3 children she did not know were alive. 2 were at the Pentagon, and her 25-year-old baby was at the tower on the 80th floor
Yeah.
in the second tower. On loan from his company, he did not work there. And David, of course, did not come. So it just makes me think that just live today. Live in present time. Love who you have in present time. Don't worry, because what's going to happen is going to happen, is how I feel. Our gentleman should not have lived, but he was curious. David should not have been in that building, but he was. So,
Comment and thanks also. There were several of us, and I can say part of me as well is something called survivor's guilt. In other words, Lois Manning had just walked into the lobby at the time when the explosion took place, and she was burned 82% of her body. I was 100 feet of the lobby, a few feet, a few minutes, a minute. How long did it take me to walk? 100 feet. So, you kind of wonder, why was I at a particular place at the time, and then why was somebody at a particular place at a particular time? So it's a good point. How are we doing on time?
I was gonna say, if we can take one more comment or question, because this lady's going to have to do another presentation.
That's okay.
Later in the afternoon.
I'm the other judge of planning.
There you go. So,
The problem is, if you give me a podium, I keep on going.
but you do it well, so that's okay.
Lisa, when I was teaching at St. Peter's University in the graduate program, our classes were 3.5 hours long.
Does anyone lean back there?
Just on a very light note, so that we can, this is a very meaningful talk, and I appreciate it, and Lisa, you did a fabulous job. But I have to tell you, I was in my salon on Pine and State, where I had been for 40 years before I gave it up, and that day I was there, and I had 3 chairs. I was working 2 of them, one in the waiting room, and somebody else came in to see when they could schedule. And when all this, never had a TV in my salon, but I got a call on my phone, and my other employee who worked was coming in around 2, said, "If you think I'm coming to work tonight, you're crazy. Do you know what's going on?" And I said, "Please stop screaming. I don't know what's going on." And then people kept getting telephone calls and telephone calls. "Come home, come home, come home." And one of the women said to me, "I have to go home, but can we get my hair done first because I have to go play bridge." So everything in perspective.
Lisa, thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this experience with you, and I hope that throughout this presentation, you learn a little bit more of what took place that day.
Thank you.
Okay.
Check out this page.
In 1993, a terrorist, a local cell in Jersey City, they tried a terrorist attack on World Trade Center. It was in the basement of one World Trade Center where they used a truck bomb. They drove a truck bomb to the lower level, the basement of World Trade Center, detonated it with the idea, they thought that by knocking out one of the corners, that the buildings would collapse. And that's what they planned to do with the attack on September 11th, is strike the building low enough where the impact would cause the top of the building to collapse, fall over into the city, into the region, into the local area. Top of it, in other words. But the idea is that if you have determined hijacker terrorists with suicide on their mind, flying an aircraft into a building, there's really not much you can do. particularly if they couldn't get into the cockpit. That was the problem, is that they couldn't get into the cockpit. With American Airlines Flight 11 and United Flight 175. Thank God, the passengers on Flight 93 were able to get into the cockpit and overcome the terrorists, and then, sacrificing their own lives, were able to crash the plane in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, otherwise saving another attack on the nation's capital. Yes, Sydney?
There were 3 planes and 3 targets.
There were
Airtrain,
4 planes.
4 planes.
There were 4 planes, 4 targets, but 19 terrorists. One of the terrorists did not make it. This is a plane on Flight 93. The targets were 1 World Trade Center, 2 World Trade Centers, the Pentagon, and people believe the Capitol in Washington. And the theory was, the consensus I should say, is that Al-Qaeda wanted to strike at the 3 foundations of American society. The World Trade Center represented the economy and finance, the business of the American economy. The Pentagon was the military structure, the military heartbeat of our nation. The Capitol was a legislative body of our nation's government. So they wanted, their plan was, they believed, to strike at the 3 tenets of American society.
The 4th plane?
The 4th plane is the one that they downed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Oh, where was that headed, you think?
That, they believe, was headed to the Capitol building in Washington. That's the best guess that the FBI came up with their investigation.
I'm confused.
Okay, the
1
first
plane for the World Trade Center, another plane for the Pentagon.
2 planes from the World Trade Center.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One American Airlines Flight 11 for 1 World Trade Center.
Yes.
United Flight 175 for 2 World Trade Center, the South Tower.
Thank you.
Flight 93 for the Capitol, but that was down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And then the 4th, I believe, was Flight 77, was the one that struck the Pentagon.
Thank you.
Mary Ann?
Yes, how soon did you get back to work after all this happened? And where did you decide to
Okay,
get back to work?
okay. Thank you for that quickly. I tried to cover just the events of that day in this presentation. But to answer your question, that evening, on evening September 11th, our executive assistant in our Office of Policy and Planning called. She was calling everyone on our office staff. Now, we only have 22 people on our staff. So she called, first of all, to find out, quite frankly, if we were alive. Second of all, how we were. And that's when I found out that my colleague, Ezra, was missing. So she said that we will reconvene on Friday at Journal Square in Jersey City, New Jersey. And we met that morning, and as a group, and Ezra was still missing. So one of the things our office director had said to us was, if you don't have it now, the first thing you need to do is get a cell phone. Because we had no computers, no offices, no files, no nothing. Everything was destroyed in the building. So the first thing I did when I got home was to get a cell phone. We reconvened that Monday in what is known as the Port Authority Technical Center. The Port Authority Technical Center is located at the mouth of the Harlem Tunnel. And it is the headquarters of the Port Authority Police Department. So we met there and we shared an office. We had an office, we had two of us per cubicle. And we shared the cubicle and we each were able to get a laptop. So that's what we used to start things off. Now, right after 9/11, each office had to appoint, each department and office had to appoint someone to the Office of Emergency Management. And I volunteered to serve as our representative to the Office of Emergency Management. And my shift was 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So our function was to bring whatever we needed to bring from our office to emergency management, vice versa. Whatever they were doing, I would report back to our office, let them know what the emergency management people were doing. I mentioned that was the first day of school in New York City. It was also my first day. At that time, I was an adjunct lecturer at the St. Peter's University in Jersey City, and I taught in the Graduate School of Business Administration in your MBA program. So that was my first day of evening class. So I had with me my textbooks, I had with me my syllabus, my attendance roster, and everything. I'm looking forward to starting my semester there. At that time, I was scheduled to teach a course in human behavior in organizations. So they asked me, the chairman of the department called, I guess it was a few days later, inquiring first how I was, and second of all, if I still wanted to teach. If not, then they could find a substitute. I said, no, I want to teach. So we started the classes a week or so later, and I was able to get some latitude from our office director, and like that I taught that I would not have to go in from the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift at the emergency management. So the Port Authority is a large organization, a quasi-government agency, quasi-state agency, servicing both New York and New Jersey, and we operate at that time the World Trade Center. We were responsible for the airports and the seaports, tunnels and bridges, and we had to keep things going. The agency itself, had to keep the trains running and the planes flying and ships coming in. So we had time to grieve, and we did grieve. We had memorial services. But the purpose of our organization or agency, despite our loss, was to keep our operations functioning. Yes?
Oh, I'm sorry. First of all, I was just so stunned by your elegant and thorough presentation. I want to thank you for all of us for the strength that it took to prepare and deliver this. But I do have one more question. Is it possible that there are still people who perished in the collapse who didn't work there but may have been visitors?
It's possible. It's hard to say because it was so early in the morning. You would think, and again, this is a big assumption, that the people who were in the towers at the time were employees of different companies. So normally, visitors, guests, tourists wouldn't be coming until later in the morning. And part of the difficulty was that there were still so many people unidentified. Even though they found remains and body parts, thank you. They found remains, it's still difficult to identify whose remains these are, so a lot of people are still unidentified. Francis?
To answer her question, I worked at 195 Broadway for 10 years. And I'd come in on PATH from Jersey. And we would be in that building sometimes 7 o'clock in the morning, eating breakfast, shopping. They had fabulous shops there. Going to the banks. So there were civilians who didn't work in the building who would be in the building that morning.
They had, for example, they had the Information Technology Conference on the 175, I think actually Windows of the World. So yes, there were people who were there for early morning conferences, and in this case, it was like a big conference, maybe early morning meetings, but we really don't know for sure how many or who they were. So it's hard to put a finger on how many people who were not employees of one of the companies whose offices when the World Trade Center were actually there. But yes, it's very conceivable that people who were not employees but were business guests or whatever were in the building at the time. Go ahead, yes, Frank. Go ahead.
probably discussed this with people who were maybe directly affected up there at the time, or maybe not thought about it, but they generally see the hijackers as with an image of serving God, or was their fanaticism political? Or how do they, what you've heard, I guess you've heard a lot about it, is it generally a religious fanaticism, or, as I say, they willing to give their lives for a political cause?
Trying to put my mind, and I shudder the thought, trying to kind of think of what the hijackers think at times, way over my pay grade. I'm really hesitant to try to figure out what the purpose was. Whether it's religious or political, I don't know. All I know is what I experienced that day and what other people experienced that day. So I really don't feel comfortable in trying to put my mind in hijackers who would fly aircraft loaded with more than 100 people into a building. I can't, for the life of me, imagine that. For me, that's unthinkable. So what their intentions were, I would let God sort that out. Okay, put it that way. I put their in God's hands. I let Him sort that out. That's the way to go by pay. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
To see where the planes hit seemed to be so strategic.
Yeah.
I just wonder if our builders here in this country need to be more careful about how buildings are structured.
Okay.
Because what is really unique about it is that the planes hit in different areas, and then the building imploded on itself. So somehow or another, they must have studied the building. It would be different if they had hit at the top or tried to come much lower. But they seem to be very strategic in where they hit and how they hit, and then see the buildings implode. And much. Well, yeah, but I didn't think it was going to fall in the city, but the thing is that they knew that a lot of people were in those buildings.
Their purpose, their intention actually was to hit around the 50th floor. Right? Almost directly in the middle of the building. Right? Because if they hit the 50th floor, it would be so top heavy that it would possibly topple and fall on the area, buildings in the area. If you look at the cover sheet of your handout, okay, the picture of the buildings. On each side of the building, those columns are perimeter support columns. There's 59 perimeter support columns on each side. And the way the buildings were constructed is that you had, on all four sides of the building, the 59 perimeter support columns and the interior core column. And it was the perimeter support columns that really held the building in place. Now there were different panels, and these, you can't see it in the picture, but there were interlocking panels about 3 stories each. They were interlocking. So they were constructed to absorb the impact of a 707 jet airplane. The first attack in 1993, they thought that if they knocked off a corner of the building, it would topple, like if you have a 4-legged desk, and you knock off one of the legs, what's going to happen? It's going to topple. They figured the same thing, that if they knocked off one of the corners of the building, it would topple. What they didn't know at the time was the lower level of the building was 7 stories deep.
Yes.
It was 7 stories deep. So even though they were able to blow up part of the corner of the building, the perimeter foundation, the perimeter columns were there to support it. Okay? So it didn't topple. But what happened was it imploded downward because, as I mentioned, there's two theories. One is the heat and fire was so intense that the floors buckled. And as they buckled, they pulled everything towards the center and then went straight down. Or the core column was compromised due to fire and heat, and it weakened, and by weakening the core column, everything went straight down. So those are the two theories of the collapse. People generally lean towards the first theory, that the floors collapsed and that put everything down. One interesting thing is that when they were going through the debris pile, some of the workers found something that actually blew their minds. They found how you have in geology like a strata of different periods in time.
Yes.
Okay, archaeologists look for that. What they found was a strata that was just over 6 feet tall. So any of you gentlemen here who was 6 feet or tall was comprised of 10 stories. 10 stories of floors was compacted into 6 feet. It was that ferocious of an implosion going downward.
Lisa, I understand that there were other buildings that collapsed too?
Yes,
It
yes.
was that immediately, right?
Pardon?
It happened in a timeline that was immediate.
Yeah, what happened was, as the towers collapsed, the debris fell on the other buildings in the area. Now, again, the first page of when you look at the first page, that describes the other buildings in the World Trade Center complex. I used the World Trade Center complex because there was more than just the twin towers. There were 7 buildings in that complex. When the World Trade Center 1 collapsed, a lot of the burning debris fell upon 7 World Trade Center, which caused fire. The 7 World Trade Center was 47 stories. And that building collapsed at 5:28 p.m. that evening. It caught fire, it burned and burned and burned, and finally, as I said, the steel was compromised, and it collapsed at 5:28 a.m. Other buildings in the area, I believe it was 92 West Street, American Express building, there's several other buildings in the area not related to the World Trade Center complex that was collateral damage, and some were destroyed. St. Nicholas Church, for example, the Greek Orthodox Church was right across the street from the World Trade Center. That was fairly destroyed. And other buildings in the area are affiliated with the Trade Center. Now, there's a pedestrian walkway over West Street that collapsed because of debris falling from one World Trade Center, collapsed the pedestrian walkway. That was problematic because they had to get the pedestrian walkway removed before they could move in the heavy equipment to remove the humongous beams of steel, some weighing more than 40 tons. So they had to get the pedestrian walkway from West Street removed and out of the area before they could move in the heavy equipment to start the procedure of getting more of the heavy steel debris out of the area. But all the buildings in that complex were destroyed. Not just the Twin Towers, but the other buildings in the complex were destroyed. And some other buildings in the area were severely damaged. That's right.
I was just wondering, sitting there, thinking about working in one of those buildings after the '93 attack, I know you had just started there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was wondering if people had a heightened sense of awareness of danger, or if they felt comfortable going to work there, if they had in the back of their minds that maybe something could happen again. I mean, did that permeate?
I can speak to my own feeling. I loved working there. I felt very comfortable working there. And it was interesting because when we have nor'easters, when you're up at maybe 60, 70 floors up, my office is, depending what department I was with at the time, was either like the 53rd floor or the 64th floor. And you'll be in your office and you'll be hearing, and that was the building swaying with the wind. Again, the buildings were constructed to be flexible to deal with the wind, not rigid, but flexible, so they would actually sway with, and you would hear it. You would hear it swaying. But for me, did I have any sense of planes crashing into the buildings? Naively, maybe not. After the 93 attack, at that time I was on the 44th floor and ended up with smoke inhalation. We had to go down darkened, black stairwells from smoke to get out of the building. But to me, it was a wonderful experience working there. It was a community, as I said, within a city. Over 90 different countries were represented in the World Trade Center. There was other camaraderie. We had entertainment on Thursdays during the summertime. To give you the experience I had, I was sitting on one of the benches, in Austin Tobin Plaza, kind of just having my lunch, and a young Japanese fellow sat next to me, and he said, "Can you do me a favor?" I said, "What is it?" He said, "Well," he says, "my manager says I need to speak better English." He says, "Can I practice English with you?" I said, "Sure." So we would meet a couple of times, depending on our schedule. We met a couple of times, and we just talked. And he gave him an opportunity to practice his English. So it was an area where people from all different countries, all different cultures worked there. And tourists came during the course of the day, business people came during the day, and it was really a city. There were times when during a given day, you would have 140,000 people in that 16 square acre of land. So it was, as I said in my opening remarks, it was a community within a city. But did I have any, I didn't really think about fear in working there. It wasn't something I thought about. Mary Ann?
Yes, you mentioned they wanted the buildings to topple instead of the way it happened. What was the advantage of having them topple? Would they kill more people that way?
The advantage of having them topple was they would fall on other buildings. In other words, if you have 50 stories or 70 stories of a building, just topple down, straight down, they would land on other buildings in the area. And or to have it in chaos and death, that would cause.
So it was to do more damage to lives and buildings.
Yeah, do more damage in Lower Manhattan. Destroy other buildings that would be within the range of the building toppling. That was initially the purpose of the first bomb in 1993, was to make the whole building topple. And again, as I mentioned with Ben's question, the hijackers wanted to fire the aircraft into around the 50th floor of the building, but the first building, they didn't hit that area. They went up to the 92nd floor, and the other one, and two World Trade Centers, they hit around the 78th, 80th floors. So, yes, go ahead.
Did you have any health issues breathing in the toxic air or anything like that? Health issues?
Pardon me?
Did you have any health issues?
No. I was not immediately in the area when the buildings toppled. As I mentioned, when I went to visit the site, it was a week and a half later, and I had my Port Authority ID, so I was able to get pretty close to the debris pile. It was really unreal. It was surreal. You couldn't really breathe because the air was thick with whatever kind of smell from the burning and smoke from the debris pile. My eyes burned. I was wearing contact lenses at the time, and my eyes were burning. I could barely breathe. And the heroes who worked the pile day in and day out, looking for remains, looking for survivors, those workers who were moving the debris from the pile, they are truly American heroes. They really are. No question about that. in some cases, they actually were victims of 9/11 too, because many of them sort of died from various forms of cancer years afterwards. But it wasn't in 2001. In 1993, I did have some smoke inhalation issues to deal with because we were in a darkened stairwell full of smoke for a long period of time. But not in 2001. Yes.
I had two experiences with the building. My father and I were visiting New York as the construction was underway. And we were able to see down the 7 stories of deep foundation. And it was fascinating to imagine what it took to imagine how to build them tall and strong. And the second thing was I went to brunch inside of one of the buildings once. And during brunch, the whole room became dark, and that's because a cloud was passing over the building. It was so tall. And I remember seeing some very impressive pieces of nature, like a huge segment of amethyst from the earth, with the stone, not the stones, but the amethyst inside. And that was just a decoration in the hallway, and things like that were destroyed. It was wonderful, but I want to ask you, how did this affect you emotionally?
Well, we talked about a little bit about this morning in our first session. One of the things we relied on was each other, our office. Now, there were many people in our office who were not in the building or in the premises at the time, because only a few of us came in at 8 o'clock. And then a lot of the other colleagues of mine would come in 9, 9:30, even 10 o'clock. And that's not to say that they would stay late. I mean, they worked around, and we had the flexibility of working around our schedule. We didn't punch a clock. I was usually in by 8 o'clock. One of my colleagues, several of my colleagues were in at 8 o'clock. One of our secretaries had to be at 8 o'clock. We had 3 secretaries. One would be there for 8 o'clock. But as Mary Ann had asked, afterwards, we relied on each other. We had lost a colleague, a very, very dear friend. His office, Ezra's, was just around the corner from mine. He would be one of the early birds there, and we would convince the morning, with other people. So we relied on each other. And some of our Port Authority colleagues, they did go for therapy. The Port Authority was beyond generous and offering various health services, mental health services, when it came to therapy or if you needed time off. So we kind of worked through it, and we relied on each other. And that's basically where we were at.
I'm impressed by your morning church visits,
Yeah.
I think God was listening.
Yeah. That was a routine I'd gotten into a couple of years previous. And St. Peter's Church, I think it's the oldest Catholic church in New York City. It was perfect because I would get into the Trade Center terminal, PATH terminal, just walk, it's only a few minutes walk from the PATH terminal to St. Peter's Church, and then have Mass stand and just walk back through the concourse and get a bit to my office. It was very, very quick and very close. And as a routine I had gotten into, I made some friends there. There were the same people who go to the same Mass every morning, and we became friends as well. But it was part of my daily routine at that time. But interesting is that the first person who officially died, other than someone being on a plane, was Father Michael Judge. And Father Michael Judge was a chaplain with the FDNY, the New York City Fire Department. And he was there to accompany the firemen, and also he was giving last rites to people who he found had died or died on the plaza. one way or another. And when the North Tower collapsed, a lot of the breeze struck the South Tower, and he was crushed in some of the breeze. The firefighters were able to retrieve his body, bring it over, and put it at the altar of St. Peter's Church, Church. And for me, that was kind of an emotional thing because I had just been in that church an hour before. You know, we were there for Mass, we received Holy Communion at that altar. So, and now, an hour or so later, here, the Catholic priest, the chaplain to the FDNY, is now laid to rest at that altar. It's just an unthinkable situation. Liz?
I worked for a company, a drilling company, and some of our guys were in New York on that day, and they called and they said that the World Trade Center was being attacked. So my coworker turned around and said to me, this guy just called and said that the World Trade Center was being attacked, and I was like, oh, he's such a baloney thrower. I can't believe anything he says. But my boss was a stock market guy, and he had a TV in his office, so I ran into his office just to see, and sure enough, you know, I saw the second plane flying into the building. Well, I know what the devastation was because my family worked in DC at the time, and when we heard that, you know, the Pentagon was being attacked, you know, we were trying to call, I was trying to call, you know, make sure that they were okay. And they were, so that was a good thing. But the company that I worked for, within 3 days, 72 hours, we were called in to do the dewatering for the subways that were flooded. And I will tell you that the men, our men that came back working on that site were, I mean, they were grown men, totally devastated. Didn't want to go back, begged my boss not to send them back to go there. So I can appreciate, you know, what you're saying about the devastation. So we kind of felt it, you know, because our guys were there and they'd come and talk to me. It was just, you know, just unbelievable.
Yeah, the FDNY firefighters, I mean, they were unbelievable among themselves because they did not want to leave the site. They wanted to be sure that they were looking for any fallen person, obviously specifically any fallen firefighters, but they did not want to leave the site. They wanted to do everything they can to find anyone who survived, and if not survivors, and retrieve the remains of those who did not survive, be able to bring them back to their family for Jesus burial. And firefighters in New York City are just remarkable. Same thing with the Port Authority Police and the NYPD. They're just remarkable individuals.
At this time, how about we leave it to one more question?
Okay.
And then we will, anybody, question, comment?
I would just like to invite everyone to join me in giving Lisa a standing